Hello everyone and welcome to this webinar on saving wildlife after bushfires. What is the evidence for effective action? My name is Rachel Morgan. I am the knowledge broker of the National Environmental Science Program's Threatened Species Recovery Hub and also the Bushfire Recovery Knowledge Broker with NRM Regions Australia, and it's great to have you all join us here today. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I come to you from today, and also acknowledging country all around the nation where everyone is dialing in from today. So I am coming to you from Ngunnawal country, where I live and work in Ngunnawal, Ngambri and Kangaroo country here in Canberra and the surrounding regions. And I have the good fortune to be part of the community here that benefits from the long custodianship of Aboriginal people over the country, the Boggs Grassy woodlands country where I live. I'd also like to acknowledge country all around the continent and recognise and emphasise the importance of giving priority to Indigenous custodianship when it comes to addressing impacts on country, including the impacts of bushfires and of introduced fire regimes and disrupted fire regimes on this country and its fauna and special species and places. So I'd like to take a moment to recognise country, to recognise elders, past, present and emerging, and also to welcome here particularly any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us today. So as I said, I am with the Threatened Species Recovery Hub and NRM Regions Australia, and this is a joint webinar series that we're bringing to you on fauna and biodiversity and bushfires. So this is the first of two webinars. We'll pop extra information about the second webinar in the chat for those of you who haven't seen it, which will be on governance and systems and how we can coordinate better for action for biodiversity and culture and species and places. To you, our audience, we'd like to invite you to introduce yourselves now in the chat. Please let us know where you're from and what Indigenous country you're dialing in from in Australia or around the world. And so you'll find the chat button at the bottom of your screen usually, and you'll need to select, introduce yourselves to all of us. We'll also have our speakers and panelists introduce themselves in the chat, and of course you'll hear from them later. At the bottom of your screen you'll also, or near the chat button, if it's not at the bottom of the screen, you'll also find your Q&A button. Now during the main discussion and presentations we'll be closing off the chat so that we can focus on our presentations and speakers, but the Q&A button will stay open the whole time. This is a chance for you to pop in your questions to our speakers all along the way, and we'll have plenty of time at the end of our main presentations to open up to a panel discussion for everyone to take part. So please pop your questions in at any point. If you would like to take a moment to upvote each other's questions, if you see a question that's particularly on your mind as well that someone else has posted, please feel free to use that Q&A function, and as questions appear you'll get the chance to upvote them as well as adding your own. So as I said, please ask any questions at any point throughout and as we go. So in a moment, we're going to be closing off the chat. Please just do take a moment now to keep introducing yourselves. It's great for our speakers and panelists to know who they're speaking with today and who's dialing in. So, so keep those introductions coming. As we do that, I'm going to move on to introducing our first speaker of the day. So we'll have a series of introductory talks, first from our research partners and then from ACT government and from Kangaroo Island, so different perspectives on wildlife management and recovery in the context of fires. First up, I'm very happy to introduce Dr. Natasha Robinson. So Natasha is a principal conservation scientist currently with the New South Wales government in the Department of Planning, Industry and Environment. She leads the development of science and research to support the Saving Our Species program in New South Wales government. And she's also a research affiliate with the Australian National University, where she helped lead the study she'll be talking about in just a moment on fire management and fauna. So she's going to kick us off by giving us the big picture, I guess, of fire management and fauna. So over to you. Thanks, Natasha.
So I'm Natasha Robinson and I'm calling in from Ngunnawal country, and I'd like to pay my respects to past, present and emerging leaders. And I'm also presenting work on behalf of several co-authors who are listed there on the slide. And I'll be talking to you today about fire-associated management actions for wildlife recovery. Australia is a fire-prone continent and many of our plants and animals are adapted to fire. However, the Black Summer fires of 2019-2020 were large and devastating to wildlife, and many of our animals were injured or killed or displaced. And future climate scenarios are predicting increasing fire extremes, and this will place greater pressure on our biodiversity. So what can we do to help wildlife survive and recover from wildfire? And what kind of management actions are beneficial for animals? So there are, in the aftermath of a big fire, many actions are taken for wildlife, and a lot of effort and resources go into trying to help wildlife survive and recover. But how effective are these actions? And actions can occur before, during or after a wildfire. So for example, these artificial shelters that were placed on Kangaroo Island were installed to help small vulnerable animals be protected from predation from introduced animals. But not all actions that are done in association with wildfire are done with fauna conservation in mind. Some actions are done for fire control, such as fire retardant drops. And the next one. And some actions are done for resource harvesting, such as salvage logging. So the impacts from these various actions can be positive, negative, or neutral. So we wanted to understand, in the context of fire, what management actions are beneficial to wildlife? And are they, in the context of when they occurred in relation to a fire, so whether they occurred before, during, or after. We also want to understand how do animals respond to these management actions, so whether they're beneficial or harmful or neutral to animals. And to understand this, we conducted a literature review of internationally published literature and also Australian grey literature, that's unpublished work. To complement this, we also undertook a survey of Australian practitioners to understand their perspectives of what they thought was effective management actions for fauna. So we found about 300 relevant studies across the globe, and these mainly came from North America, Europe, and Australia. Most of these studies were done on birds, invertebrates, and mammals, but other taxa groups such as frogs, reptiles, and fish were not well studied. Forests and grasslands were well studied, but other fire-prone landscapes such as alpine, wetland, and riparian zones were less studied. Certain actions such as salvage logging, the responses to these were well studied. And lastly, many of these responses were species specific and context dependent. So the response to one management action may have meant that a certain one animal responded positively to that, but another animal was harmed by that action. And that management action wasn't necessarily consistent across different landscapes. So it had a different effect whether it occurred in forest or grasslands. However, overall, we were able to catalogue these different types of management actions into roughly beneficial or harmful actions. So the list of actions you see here on the screen here, these were generally beneficial to animals. And these included things like resource preservation, so protecting habitat from fire, providing food, water and nest boxes, doing post-fire habitat restoration, doing wildlife conservation efforts such as animal rescues and translocations, implementing feral predator control immediately after the fire, and also competitor management, so such as exclusion fencing. But these last two types of actions were generally harmful, so fire control and resource harvesting or manipulation. And so certain actions can actually work against other actions that are aiming to conserve wildlife. So in Australia, many actions are done in association with fire to assist wildlife recovery. but there's little actual published evidence to support their effectiveness. Despite this, many actions may be valid and reasonable, and much knowledge is held internally and may not necessarily be written up in reports. And that's why the survey was important to capture perspectives and locally held information from various conservation managers and wildlife recovery practitioners. So what we found from the survey was that most practitioners considered that their actions were effective and most actions were monitored. However, it will be important to make sure that this monitoring data is analysed and written up and then shared widely so that this information can be used to inform future decisions. So in summary, despite little published evidence, much knowledge can be known internally, and appropriate management actions can be informed by species ecology and their responses to similar disturbances and management actions. In the absence of fire-specific literature, practitioners need to draw on a broader range of knowledge to help inform decisions, but remembering that many responses will be species-specific and context-dependent. Actions are not always implemented for wildlife. There are a range of objectives besides fauna conservation. And so monitoring is important to understand the impacts of various actions, what are effective actions for wildlife, and what are harmful, so that we can direct our effort and resources effectively. It's also important to ensure that information is accessible so that knowledge can be easily shared and help inform management elsewhere. So I'd like to acknowledge that this work was a collective effort, and if you'd like to know more about the project, you can head to the Threatened Species Hub Recovery website.
Thanks, Natasha, and thank you for that overview and introduction to the context in which we're thinking about these issues of fauna recovery and what we do and don't know. So just a reminder to everyone, please post your questions into the Q&A. We'll get to those in the discussion in the second half of this webinar. So please do start those coming now and start thinking about what it is that you might need to know about fauna recovery or might be curious about what any of our speakers say. I'd like to particularly prompt you to post any questions for Natasha into the Q&A early, because Natasha has to leave us partway through due to an unforeseen clash, so partway through the Q&A. So we'll have plenty of time with Natasha at the start of that discussion, but please make sure you get those questions up to her. So next up, I'm going to introduce our second speaker. So that's Renee Brewata. Now, Renee comes to us from the ACT government, where she is Senior Ecologist for Threatened Fauna with the Conservation Branch of the ACT government's Environment Department. She has over 25 years experience as an ecologist working with a wide range of species and ecosystems across Australia. She's currently a member of the IUCN Conservation Planning Specialist Group, and she's also an adjunct associate professor at the University of Canberra. And Renee's going to be talking to us about the ACT government's response and fauna recovery in the wake of the fires in the ACT. Renee.
Yeah, thanks so much, Rachel. Just checking you can see my screen and you can hear me.
We can hear you. You'll need to go into slideshow presentation mode. Perfect. Seems like it's coming through now. Yep.
Fantastic, thanks very much, and Yuma everyone, thanks for joining today. So today I'm going to talk on post-fire recovery of fauna in Namadgi National Park, ACT. I'm also joining you from Ngunnawal country, and I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people as the traditional custodians of the land on which we live and work, and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. I'm going to present on behalf of the Conservation Research Team, which is a team within the Environment Planning Sustainable Development Directorate of the ACT Government. So, like much of Eastern Australia, ACT got hit by a large-scale wildfire in 2020. We only have one national park in the ACT, and that's Namadgi National Park. And the wildfire is called the Aurora Valley Wildfire, and it burnt approximately 88,000 hectares, which was approximately 80% of the national park. And 22% of this area was burnt at high or very high severity. This is not the first time we've seen such a large-scale wildfire. In 2003, Namadgi National Park actually experienced another large-scale bushfire. So that's only 17 years ago, and greater than 90% of the same area was burnt. So the rapid risk assessment that was conducted identified three major fauna groups that were at high risk following the fire. These were threatened species, particularly species dependent on alpine sphagnum bog habitat within the park, aquatic and riparian and ecosystem species, and hollow-dependent fauna species. So in our park, it's the yellow-bellied and greater glider that are threatened. So today I'm just going to give a very brief overview of some post-fire projects for fauna recovery that are being undertaken in Namadgi National Park. The focus of these projects is on forming evidence-based decision-making for post-fire management of both impacted fauna groups, species, and also the habitats that they depend upon. The projects aim to understand not only the impacts of fire, but sometimes are trialling new techniques for recovery. They include both research and monitoring at the ecosystem level, so of broad fauna groups across the landscape scale, species-specific projects like on threatened species, and also core habitat restoration. We're currently 2 years post-fire, so most of these projects are ongoing. Their effectiveness of the interventions and the monitoring outcomes are yet to be assessed. So the first project I'm going to cover is the project that looks at the effects of bushfire and plant burning on fauna. And this is a long-term project being undertaken by our fire team in the sub-alpine woodlands. It's aimed at informing a risk-based approach to fire management in Namadgi National Park in the longer term. So the questions they're asking are, what are the effects of planned burning, bushfire on fauna? And this includes broad groups of fauna such as birds, reptiles, mammals, including bats. And they're looking at species richness, diversity, exotic versus native species abundance, and the presence of key species like threatened species or fire-sensitive species. They're also asking the question, what are the effects of planned burning, bushfire on habitat structure? And what are the interaction of these two elements? Are the effects of plant burning bushfire on fauna mediated by habitat structure? The second project I'd like to introduce to you today is the large glider population habitat assessment. That's we're undertaking and commencing this year. So this is a Commonwealth funded project. It builds on previous pre-fire survey data that we collected in 2018 for both glider populations and hollow availability. We're going to compare pre and post-fire tree hollow densities, conduct modelling to predict hollow densities across Namadgi National Park post-fire, and also develop a habitat suitability model for greater gliders. Following this, we're going to undertake post-fire surveys of glider populations, both to test the habitat suitability model that we pull together and also understand post-fire distribution of both species. We're also going to assess the impact of prescribed fire on glider populations using thermal drones for surveying as a survey technique. And so we're going to do this in unburnt areas, both pre and post-fire prescribed burn. The third project I'd like to introduce to you is, can supplementary habitat assist in recolonisation of burnt areas by small mammals and reptiles? So this is a PhD project which is being conducted in collaboration with ANU, and it's commenced in 2020 and will run to about 2023. And the aim is to improve structural habitat complexity post-fire and test whether this is effective in helping recolonisation of burnt areas. So the student has treatments in severe and low fire intensity areas, in dry sclerophyll forest communities within Namadgi National Park. And supplementary habitat has been constructed from fallen timber piles that you can see in the pictures there, wire mesh, or a combination of both the timber and the wire mesh, and she's comparing activity of small mammals and reptiles in these areas, treatment areas, compared to control areas with no treatment, to test whether or not we can actually help recolonisation post-fire. The fourth project I'd like to introduce you today is whether or not we can use specifically designed nest boxes for assisting recovery of uncommon fauna after bushfire. Many people in the audience would be aware that nest boxes are often a go-to for management action after fire, but we don't really understand whether or not they always have a beneficial impact. So this is a Commonwealth-funded collaborative project. It's also in collaboration with our NRM, our nest box experts, ANU, and the community group. We've designed 160 nest boxes that are suitable for less common bird and bat species. And we're looking at 5 different types of nest boxes, 3 bird boxes and 2 bat boxes. We'll also be undertaking hollow availability assessments throughout the project. And we're going to place the nest boxes across 3 different vegetation communities and across 2 different fire severities, both high and low, and monitor the usage over the next 3 years. Finally, our 5th project today is our Broadtooth rat recovery project Postfire. This was Commonwealth funded in its first year. There's 2 main components to the project, and the first is understanding post-fire distribution and recolonisation of burnt areas over time by the species. So we've established some long-term scat run surveys at 9 sites, and we're going to monitor these for recolonisation every 2 to 3 years. So we understand how the species can recolonise from the 2 unburnt areas that they still inhabit, whether or not they and how long it takes them to recolonise these areas. The second part of the project is using genetic analysis to understand recolonisation pathways. So we're working with the University of Canberra and DPIE to develop a new genetic analysis method that will enable future population assessment using scats. So negate the need for trapping, because these little critters are actually really difficult to trap. So talking about important habitats is also part of our management response. So in the Alpine sphagnum bogs, we're doing a rehabilitation program. All of but 2 of our bogs in the Madgy National Park burnt in the Aurora Valley Fire. And these are really important habitat for threatened species, including the broadtooth rat, but also for the northern corroboree frog and species, mountain spiny crayfish species, etc. Restoration activities are being undertaken at 9 bog sites, and the aim of these activities is to retain water, prevent incision and erosion, support sphagnum recovery, and they're using leaky weirs, which are also known as coir lugs, and shade cloth to do this. There's a 10-year program and adaptive management monitoring plan to assess recovery and the effectiveness of these works. So in summary, we're in uncharted territory with 2 large-scale fires in 17 years. We're trialling new approaches to both management interventions and supporting recovery to inform decision making. We're trying to address some knowledge gaps. We're tracking recovery over time, but this needs ongoing resources to provide quality data and evidence. And also we need to consider climate change, which will reshape these landscapes in the future. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Renee. Really good to hear about the work going on there, and I look forward to asking you more about that in our Q&A. Next up, we have another group of speakers this time. This is a group of people who have worked incredibly effectively in Kangaroo Island in the period after the wildfires there in the Black Summer fires. So we'll have 3 short presentations from our colleagues at Kangaroo Island. Paul Jennings, our first presenter, is the project manager for the Kangaroo Island Dunnart with the Kangaroo Island Landscape Board. After Paul, he will hand over to Carlia Beres, who's the project manager for the Kangaroo Island Black Cockatoo with the Landscape Board. And then we'll hear from Heidi Groffen, who helps to run the Kangaroo Island Land for Wildlife group. So they're going to be giving us a joint series of presentations about the work that they've done to recover fauna and protect the fauna habitat in the context of the fires at Kangaroo Island. So over to you, Paul.
Hi, I'm just checking that you can hear me clearly.
Yes, we can.
Yes. Fantastic. So, yeah, thanks for that introduction. So my name is Paul Jennings. I'm with the Kangaroo Island Landscape Board. I'm also joined here today by Carlia Beres, and we'd first like to begin by acknowledging the Kaurna, Ngarrindjeri, Narungga and Bangala people, traditional custodians of the land on which we are on today, and the elders past, present and future. First wanted to start this presentation. It's not moving forward. Oh, there we go. Just a bit delayed. Just by briefly outlining our project objectives. First of all, was really around mapping the current distribution of the Kangaroo Island Dunnart post-fire, and then reducing the threat from feral cat predation until we had a better understanding of the status of this species to direct further actions. So 20 months on from the devastating 2019 20 KI bushfires, which impacted greater than 96% of Kangaroo Island Dunnart across Kangaroo Island. We're starting to learn a lot more about the resilience of this species to fire in terms of providing valuable information for future recovery efforts. It's quite incredible, really, considering the scale of the fires, how resilient this species is, and also considering that all but one of 14 known sites where Dunarts were recorded pre-fire were severely burnt. I just wanted to highlight one of the most catastrophic days in terms of the conservation for this species, and that was on the 3rd of January under catastrophic weather conditions where fires broke containment lines on the northwest coast of Kangaroo Island, and you can see the fire scar map in the background of this slide. They travelled south to the southern coastline of Kangaroo Island and then to the northeast to the central portion, so 60 kilometres in one day, and most of that was under severe and extreme conditions. And that pretty much is the entire Dunart distribution as we know it pre-fire. So this really spurred on rapid implementation of post-fire monitoring, which optimised detection and protection of the species. This prioritisation of sites was really driven by the work that Rosemary Honan did pre-fire in terms of developing a species distribution model for the species, which predicted KI Dunart occurrence. This heat map just demonstrates the darker areas where there is the highest probability of detecting Dunarts, and our survey sites have been overlain on top of this. Yellow sites are ones that have been surveyed, and we've currently detected Dunarts at 66 of these 220 sites. They've been detected in a range of habitats from the central lateritic plateau to the coastal heath of the northwest and southwest coast. They've also been more frequently detected from burnt sites than unburnt sites, which was not a result that we anticipated when the surveys began. Our easternmost detection site is on private property. You can see up in the northeast corner of those red dots, and our average time of detection at sites is 29 days. We've also established 25 long-term monitoring sites in collaboration with WWF and the Eyes and Recovery Project. And this is a partnership with Google and Wildlife Insights to use AI technology to streamline image analysis to inform near real-time and rapid management responses. These long-term sites will help us understand the spatial and temporal trends for the species. And this image here is just an example of the interface that Wildlife Insights have developed, and also around some of the information that we're starting to get from these longer-term monitoring sites as well. It's an encouraging sign the species is persisting in the landscape, with the number of sites and individual detections increasing during February, March and April, and it's possibly associated with dispersal of young of the year. So what next? It's really, since the fires, there's been an unprecedented level of survey effort across the island to detect Kangaroo Island Dunarts and threatened species. We have a very high confidence in detecting Kangaroo Island Dunarts, not very high confidence in catching them, but certainly detecting them. It gives us an opportunity to inform a longer term strategy to monitor change for the species, but data deficiencies remain a limiting factor to provide suitable levels of protection. There's considerable research is needed to address those critical knowledge gaps that we still have to better understand the species ecology and update priority recovery actions for the species. The environment post-fire now represents a really good opportunity for us to address those questions. And to support that and help answer some of those questions, we've been working recently with Zoos SA, who are leading a project to capture and radio tag Kangaroo Island Dunarts. Here's an image of a recent capture, our first capture as part of that trapping program. It's a female Dunart, and quite surprisingly, she was carrying some pouch young, 8 pouch young. And we had a recapture of her approximately 8 days later, and the size of those young, still carrying 8, had doubled in size. So looking at what we're doing around threat mitigation, so everybody understands quite clearly the impact that cats have on native wildlife, and also how those impacts are magnified in the post-fire environment. So using camera trap arrays pre and post-fire, Rosemary Honan's research observed a significant decline in cat numbers and also their activity, which provided us with a real opportunity to assist fauna recovery through early and sustained control post-fire. We've been achieving this through broad-scale cat control and also looking at site-level management of feral cats where Kangaroo Island dunnuts and threatened species have been detected. Broad-scale control really is about establishing buffer zones around these priority areas and reducing the impact and potential for reinvasion of cats. We've been using a variety of control tools, cage and leg hold traps, also broad-scale baiting to access areas which are within our parks and reserve system, which are inaccessible and for many reasons hard for us to effectively control cats. We've also looked at adopting advances in technology to stream feral cat management and through trap alert systems and also 4G camera networks to give us some real-time indication of where cats are moving and when they're present. Just looking at a map of KI in relation to the fire scar, the pink shaded area is where we are currently and continue to control feral cats. So are we having an impact? So to date, we've removed nearly 750 feral cats since the fires. And the highest number of these feral cats are within forestry and agricultural land, which borders our protected areas and our high priority sites. So there's a massive potential for reinvasion if we're not focusing on these areas as well. The techniques that we're using have been proven very successful on Kangaroo Island. And we're also looking at ways which we can measure this cat control over time and if it's actually having an impact on that population. So we're comparing catch per unit effort between new and controlled areas, and we also have broad scale cat camera arrays which we're hoping can give us some information about changes in cat numbers and activity as a result of baiting programs and also ongoing control methods as well. So while signs are optimistic for the Kangaroo Island dunner, there's still some concern for the species in the future. Feral cat control following wildfire and addressing other key threats is likely to enhance the likelihood of threatened species persistence and recovery. And just want to acknowledge the projects that we're working under. Thanks.
So we're going to go straight to Kalia now. Well, she's just setting up.
Awesome. Okay, so my name's Kalia Beres. I'll be talking about the Glossy side of things for the Kangaroo Island Landscape Board. So we'll just see, we'll go straight to the map. So here's the same map that Paul just showed. So the red is the fire scar of the 2019-20 wildfire on Kangaroo Island. And what we have in the yellow there is glossy black cockatoo habitat, so both feeding and nesting habitat. So glossy black cockatoos are habitat specialists. On Kangaroo Island, they feed solely on one species of she oak, the drooping she oak, and they require large hollows in old age eucalypts to nest. So they really require these two habitats to be quite close together, which is why you can see those yellow areas. There's only a very small area of Kangaroo Island where they can persist. As you can see, the fire scar overlapped with a lot of glossy black cockatoo habitat. 54% of their feeding habitat was burnt to an extent that it isn't available as a food source again until it regenerates. And we lost about 38% of our nest trees. That's across the island though. For the nest trees that were within the fire scar, it's about 50% of those trees were destroyed by fire. Around 75% of the glossy black cockatoo population on Kangaroo Island lived within that burnt area and used the habitat there. We did undertake a population census in 2020, in about 12 months ago now, because we're just doing our next one right now. And we recorded 454 individuals. So it is the highest population count we've ever had. There has been constant management of this population since 1995. And so what this really shows is that we have the highest population we've ever had thanks to a long-term management program, but they're now confined to less than half the habitat they used to have. So post-fire, straight after the fire, we undertook those surveys to assess where the birds could actually persist because it's really based on the feeding habitat. They can't be too far from drooping she oak woodlands. And after that, we've been installing new nest boxes in close proximity to that habitat. We've installed 60 new nest boxes, so we have about 114 functional nest boxes across Kangaroo Island to supplement those natural hollows. We've also reinstated possum exclusion collars and done canopy pruning on over 200 nest trees to prevent predation of nests. So brush-tailed possums, although native to Kangaroo Island, are a big predator of eggs and nestlings. So we've done that to ensure that the population has the best chance of good recruitment and successful nesting going forward after the fire. We've also planted more than 13,000 she oak seedlings across Kangaroo Island, grown here in our native plant nursery at the Landscape Board. And we've planted this across around 60, I think, different properties now within the range of different glossy black cockatoo flocks. We're also carrying out quite a few post-fire monitoring surveys. So we're monitoring nesting success annually. We're monitoring flock movements. We have a really good cohort of birds in the population that have stainless steel leg bands, which are individually numbered. So we can look at where they're occurring across the island and also look at survival. We're measuring population size, which is where we got our result from last year. We're doing that again right now. And we're also looking at the habitat. So we're looking at post-fire recruitment of drooping she oak seedlings to try and understand better the sort of fire regimes that we want to promote good quality feeding habitat for the birds. So in terms of how the glossy population actually responded to the fire, we still have flocks persisting throughout Kangaroo Island in all the flock regions that they occurred in pre-fire. However, their habitat has shifted, so they're really confined to much smaller home ranges than they were before in that burnt area. In heavily burnt areas, flocks are restricted to quite small areas. Some flocks have lost up to 90% of their feeding habitat, and they're generally now just occurring in close proximity to that feeding habitat. Nesting success hasn't actually changed since pre-fire levels, but what we are finding is in the heavily burnt areas, we're recording fewer pairs nesting. This could either be because they're nesting in new areas that we haven't found yet, or it could be because of the food pressures in those areas, the birds might actually be choosing not to breed. And we didn't, given that population estimate as well, we didn't actually have any evidence of significant mortality during or immediately after the fires. But I guess what we still are thinking that we've had a couple of good rainfall years. I think when we'll really see pressure on these flocks is if we have a period of drought or really low rainfall years when the she oaks are probably less likely to be producing good cone crops. So habitat recovery timelines, this is the same picture, well, a picture from the same area. You can see the hills in the background before and after fire. And from our monitoring, we're recording post-fire seedling densities of she oaks of up to 500 seedlings per square metre. Now, given they're quite a large tree, they grow several metres high by several metres wide. That's really high density. The average is more around 100 seedlings per square metre. So we've been also visiting some patches that burnt in previous fires. Some patches that burnt 13 to 14 years ago still have multiple stems per square metre and still aren't producing seed yet, so they're still not a food source. And so we're looking at probably 15 to 20 years before these burnt patches are going to become available as food again for the glossy black cockatoos. Hence, revegetation has actually become a really important part of our program again. Well-spaced she oaks, if we plant them out on cleared agricultural land, can be producing seed in as little as 5 years. So they're actually going to become available to the population a lot sooner than that burnt remnant habitat. So in terms of what the fires have taught us, one of the big things is long-term management of the population over recent decades has likely contributed to their resilience in this wildfire event. In 1995, the population was really small. It was about 158 individuals, and it was clustered in that northwest corner of the island. Thanks to the fact that it's now over double the size and the birds are spread across the entire island, we actually still have flocks that have not been affected by this fire. So it's that long-term management that's really put them in this great position. But revegetated she oak has also become really vital feeding habitat for some flocks post-fire. Birds are now using revegetation more and more. And really, you know, what we've seen is that the best time to plant a tree was 10 years ago. But the next best time is now, so we're planting more and more. And we're finding that even people who have planted she oaks over 10 kilometres from the other nearest feeding site, the birds are now going there and visiting those isolated patches. And the good thing about those isolated patches is they were outside of the fire scar. And so spreading our she oak across the landscape, given these birds are highly mobile, our strategy now is to really space our plantings in a really large area across the island so that hopefully they won't all be impacted by fire at once. So that's all here on the glossy black cockatoos. Thank you.
Thanks, Kalia, and over to you now, Heidi.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk to you about the Kangaroo Island Land for Wildlife program, which is a private land conservation program we started in late 2017. So our goal is to survey and monitor the Kangaroo Island dunner and other priority threatened species. And we've co-developed a standard camera trapping methodology to detect dunnarts, and thanks to Rosie for her prior work before the fires and guiding us on how best to do this. So another goal is to increase our knowledge and understanding for long-term protection of threatened species with private landholders with us the whole way. Our effort has increased significantly post-fire, and a lot of our work now is around feral cat and pig control, Phytophthora cinnamomi, dieback mapping and management, and of course fire management planning with private landholders. So we've got 3 main management zones across the fire scar, as you can see here in the yellow. We have the Northwest Conservation Alliance, which is a large unburnt area within the middle of the fire zone. We have the Western River Management Zone and the Church Road Gossland Management Zone. Now, these are our priority areas because pre-fire, we were monitoring Kangaroo Island dunnart populations. And of course, post-fire, we commenced that work immediately after the fires again. So to start with, the Western River Refuge property. This was burnt late December, I should say. And as you can see on the photo on the right, our monitoring sites were severely impacted as well as the habitat. A couple of days after those fires, we went straight out there and we found some small unburnt patches within this property. We immediately reset our camera monitoring driftline fences and thankfully detected Kangaroo Island dunnarts within these unburnt patches. So our pre-fire conservation action planning meant we could immediately build a feral cat exclusion fence around the critical unburnt area, thanks to our solid partnership with Australian Wildlife Conservancy and the Doe family landholders. The Western River Critical Refuge is 13.6 hectares and it was completed just 6 weeks after the fire. Stage 2 was completed in December 2020, and this is 8.8 kilometre fence protecting 369 hectares. No cats are inside this fenced refuge area. Kangaroo Island dunnarts and other threatened species are stable within this refuge. Our camera monitoring occurs outside the fenced area also and will continue long term. We've also set a number of shelter tunnels within the fenced area and outside the fenced area so that we can also monitor threatened species or smaller threatened species within them. Continued feral cat control outside the refuge is critical for threatened species dispersing through this fence. Our seasonal fauna monitoring of vertebrate species inside and outside the fence is ongoing, and this is a young female, juvenile female that was caught during our last session of trapping. I'll move on now to the Gosslands Church Road Management Zone. This was a former KI dunnart hotspot pre-fire. As you can see from the photo, there was minimal standing vegetation or leaf litter left post-fire. Little chance of dunnart survival after the fire, so we thought. And KI dunnarts luckily were detected on camera post-fire. We immediately set shelter tunnels across this landscape and across a few properties. These shelter tunnels provide temporary shelter in a burnt landscape. They link vegetation patches, not that there was a lot of vegetation patches left here. We put cameras inside these shelter tunnels and also set a number of survey sites with cameras so that we could continue monitoring. We have dunnarts, bush rats, superb fairy wrens, shy heath wren, white-browed scrub wrens, and a number of other species that utilise these shelter tunnels still today, and of course are becoming more and more frequent in detections as time goes on after the fire. And the last management zone that we've been working really hard to protect is the Northwest Conservation Alliance. So this is an unburnt patch that is 4,200 hectares large, and it spans across 10 privately owned properties where we're working closely with all of these landholders who own these properties. Invertebrate surveys, threatened plant surveys, fire management planning, and of course fauna surveys, both live trapping and camera trapping, have occurred. And our threat reduction activities, feral cat monitoring control, PC dieback management and pig control are ongoing. Our seasonal fauna trapping surveys have been successful. We've caught a lot of different species, but as you can see, that KI Dunnart there just looked into that bucket, and we are yet to catch a KI Dunnart within this unburnt area. We will do our next lot of trapping in a couple of weeks, so fingers crossed. Feral cat control is keeping us busy, as I've mentioned. This is one of the largest feral cat camera arrays that we're looking after. We've got 62 cameras set across this northwest area, 500 metres apart. So these cameras are helping guide our control efforts. And what we have learned is that reinvasion rate of feral cats after we've controlled is really rapid. And this just indicates to us that the feral cat control cannot slow down. We need to keep going now that we've confirmed that reinvasion rate is rapid. This map here shows you the control effort across the 3 management zones. The red dots are where we have removed feral cats from the landscape, and the yellow dots are where we are still ongoing with our control effort. Over the last 3 months, we've removed over 200 cats just alone in the 3 management zones. So combined with the landscape board and Dew doing their cat control, there's a lot of feral cats out there post-fire, and we need to continue working really hard to keep their numbers down. We use all the tools that we can use for our feral cat control. This is an example of the Felix grooming traps. They're probably one of our #1 control techniques. We've got 12 across the 3 management zones. They're really successful for our work, and we really like using them. We also use cage traps and soft jaw leg holds and do thermal shooting. All of the cats that we remove from the landscape, we collect their stomach content. And with this, we have determined that feral cats do prey on the Kangaroo Island Dunnart, as you can see. These Dunnart samples were taken from cats in a landscape area where we haven't actually detected them on camera before. So it's another way of surveying for threatened species that is successful. So with all of this, we'll continue on with our work to support private landholders in threatened species conservation post-fire. And we're working with a lot of different non-government organisations, BirdLife Australia and conservation landholders, to keep monitoring our threatened species. And we're very thankful for the partnerships that we have. And thanks everyone for listening.
That's great. Thanks, Heidi. We'll hear more from you and from Pat in just a moment in the Q&A. I'm going to now take a moment to introduce our remaining panelists so that we can open up to the fuller Q&A. And so we have 2 others joining us again from work on Kangaroo Island. First up, we have Rosemary Honan. So Rosie is currently with NRM South in Tasmania, and she's also an adjunct research fellow at Charles Darwin University. So through that role with Charles Darwin, she did research on the response of cats to the extensive wildfires on Kangaroo Island in 2019-20, so among other things. So Rosie, can you please tell us very briefly about your bushfire-related research and what you learned about cats following fires on Kangaroo Island that was relevant to the response?
Thanks, Rachel. So we were really interested in seeing how the cat population responded to those huge fires on KI, particularly in the context of research that's been done in Northern Australia that indicates that cats can be attracted to fire skies, and they're actually more effective hunters in those areas because they're so open, the habitats are so open. But surprisingly, there hasn't been a lot of research done in temperate Southern Australia. We were really lucky on Kangaroo Island to have data pre-fire on cat densities from 9 sites across the island. Of those sites, 7 of those were burnt in the fire and 3 were unburnt. And so we were able to compare cat density at burnt and unburnt sites at 2 time periods, 3 to 8 months post-fire and then 12 months post-fire as well. And essentially what we found was that they did take a bit of a hit. So there was a 3 to 8 months post-fire, we saw there was a reduction, 57% reduction in the number of individuals and 67% reduction in the number of nights with cats detections. And there were actually too few detections to actually compute density estimates post-fire for all of those burnt sites. 11 to 12 months, they still hadn't recovered. So there was evidence that the population did take a pretty direct hit from the fire, but as you've seen from the work from Pat and Heidi and Paul, there is still a lot of cats moving around that landscape, and re-immigration rates are a massive issue. So certainly supporting the cat control post-fire has really, I think, changed the game and changed the trajectory of recovery for Kangaroo Island. Yeah.
Thanks. That's great. Thanks, Rosie, and really important kind of to know that integration of research and practice, which we'll explore more in the chat. So Pat Hodgins is the last of our panelists that I'm going to bring in today. So I would like to introduce Pat Hodgins. He is a fauna ecologist with a background in threatened species management and also cat research and management as well. And he's also with Kangaroo Island Land for Wildlife. Now, Pat, I'm going to throw you a little bit of a left field question and say, how important are species like the Kangaroo Island dunnart, the glossy blacks and others for community in Kangaroo Island? And, you know, as a sort of priority response to the fires, what was your sense of being involved in that response through protecting those species?
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me okay? Yep. Okay. Yeah. So I guess in the context of Kangaroo Island, the fire was massive. And, you know, we've seen the maps of the huge fire scar, and considering that there's lots of, you know, houses and farm areas, and, you know, massive impacts on that whole community and tourism as well. So I think it was a very full on time for everyone on the island, no matter what you did. And I think, you know, the concern for wildlife was, you know, was huge, whether it be Kangaroo Island dunnart, southern brown bandicoots, glossy blacks, even species like the koala, which is interestingly introduced to the island. But nevertheless, the focus was massive, and I think the small wins that we were getting with detecting some of these species, like for the KI dunnart, for example, like no one would have thought nearly 2 years on that we'd be in the position that we are now. You know, we've you know, learned a lot about the species. But at the time, it was, you know, it was looking pretty bleak for a lot of these species, like the glossies and the dunnarts. So I think the small wins and seeing the on-ground action, I think was really good for the community to really get behind the work that was happening, whether it be the surveys, whether it be feral cat control, or building a feral cat exclusion fence. And I think you know, our community is really involved in all of this work. So. And, you know, and Kangaroo Island is, you know, a lot of these species are endemic to the island. So the Kangaroo Island dunnart is found nowhere else. So the islanders do have a real sense of ownership over these species. And I think everyone in the community can be really proud of, you know, really pulling together at a time of crisis. So it's, you know, there has been some really good positive outcomes out of a pretty horrific scenario.
Yeah, thanks, Pat. And perhaps we'll get to more of that in the discussion in just a moment. So we're going to open up now to Q&A, and thank you for everyone who's been sending through questions in the Q&A panel. There's still time to add questions. We'll get to as many of those as possible, and also to upvote each other's questions. I'm going to actually go to the top voted question now, but also broaden it out a little bit. So Sam Dutton has asked about, for Natasha in particular, whether you found any mixed, what your findings were on the supplementary feeding of fauna after fires. And were these findings mixed? Were they positive for native species recovery? Or, you know, was there a change in behaviour, you know, response by predators or others in response to supplementary feeding or competitor species? So from the literature, what have we learned and what is still yet to know? But before I kind of asked you that directly, I'm going to I'm going to just make a general comment that we also heard about some of these common management responses from Renee as well. You know, testing out the role of supplementary habitat, testing out the role of nest boxes. So Renee, I'm just going to go to you after Natasha and really think about what we know, but Natasha, perhaps you can comment as well, about what the research to date actually tells us about these things and what the importance is of ongoing research, you know, for supplementary feeding, but also supplementary habitat and nest boxes work. So to you first, Natasha, and then to Renee.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And so I guess that's, an issue with some of our work is that we didn't actually find that many published articles to support the evidence for any of these actions. So in the case of supplementary feeding, we found only a few studies across a few different taxa groups. And generally the responses were neutral to positive. But it was sometimes negative if supplementary feeding was considered, there was competition for that supplementary feed. So there was a study done with northern hairy-nosed wombats and so it's one of the hairy-nosed wombats, and it was actually not even done in relation to fire. It was just sort of tangentially looking at the effects of fire and drought, and they put out supplementary feeding and actually found that it drew in other competitors such as kangaroos. And so supplementary feeding can be a bit perverse if it actually draws other non-target animals to it. But yeah, overall we didn't find a huge body of evidence, but this is, I guess, applies to most of these management actions because we don't actually have that fire specific literature on whether these management actions are effective. We, I guess, have to draw from our knowledge more broadly. So, and that also is linked into that behaviour question. We don't have any information specific to fire at this point in time, but we can draw from more broader literature looking at the impacts when you put out supplementary feeding in other situations, for example.
Yeah, and so over to you, Renee, on, I just want to kind of open this up a bit to your work, really doing that research on supplementary habitat, and maybe I'll ask you to explore the importance of that research and whether you actually know whether there's existing research on these matters or whether this is really new, what you're doing in the ACT.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. Look, I'd have to agree with Natasha. Look, I'm not specifically doing this. This is a collaborative project with ANU, and this is a PhD project. So just to make that clear, but from what I know and from what I've discussed with the PhD student, is that there is actually limited amount of research post-fire. As Natasha alluded to, there's a lot of interventions that we do for recovery of fauna in sort of depauperate landscapes or agricultural landscapes, restored landscapes, even right down to sanctuaries and fencing out predators. But actually post-fire, there's quite a bit of evidence lacking, and where projects are done, quite often they're not published, they're in the grey literature, or there's not long-term monitoring, as I alluded to. Long-term monitoring and trying to gain that real solid evidence base for management action takes time and it takes money. So these lot of fires has given us that opportunity to try and put in place some of these longer-term studies for understanding what these interventions actually lead us to, and if we can elicit a positive response from fauna. In terms of the supplementary habitat, I think there's also a lot of things we need to consider, and we are considering the study that we're doing. So proximity to unburned habitat, the different vegetation communities, different response to different fauna groups, temperature changes. I know that the PhD student is also monitoring temperature changes over time. So there's lots of different elements to understand whether or not this can be successful in a situation. And I certainly think it's definitely worth exploring. I know there's some research going on in Victoria currently as well, and I'm hoping that by the end of sort of over the next few years, that research will start to be published and come to light, and we can really broaden our evidence base for that action. Similarly for nest boxes, now there's been nest boxes, as I mentioned, are quite a common tool, or a visual tool, I guess, to be used, but we are aware from the literature and other work that there can be negative consequences, honeybees or more common fauna dominating, and you end up with just more common fauna. So we're trying to do something a little bit different with this study. Again, there's not a lot of work done with nest boxes post-fire. There's a lot of work done with nest boxes in urban landscapes, rural landscapes, forestry landscapes, but not post-fire. and very little we could find on actually specifically designed nest boxes to try and encourage uncommon fauna and discourage common fauna. And there's a lot of work done, particularly by Alice McClashen, I'd like to recognise, and Michael Penne in actually doing the design for the bird and bat boxes. Michael's designed some boxes specifically for forest bats, and we're going to see whether or not this works. So this is actually a really quite a trial study, this one. Yep.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Renee. And I think this is going to be a theme that we explore throughout this discussion. But I think back to you, Natasha, since I know you have to leave us early, and really on the same topic of the availability of knowledge to people in the, especially in those emergency moments after fire. So do you have any comments just to kick us off on where information is held together or shared in the context of fires and how we can perhaps improve our systems to make these more available? I think it was a very specific question about how information from your research can be accessed, but also more broadly, you know, what is the accessibility of research information for fauna recovery post fires, and how can we improve that?
Yeah, it's a really good point. So our research is actually been submitted to journals, so it hopefully be peer reviewed and available through that avenue, but also reports will be made available on the TSR Hub webpage. But in general, I guess I really would like to highlight that it'd be great to have be able to find this information more easily, because a lot of people are doing really great stuff. They're doing a lot of actions, potentially even monitoring them, observing the effects, and have some general knowledge, maybe even some good data to show whether they're effective or not. And it would be really great to put this in some sort of place that's accessible, whether it's one big central repository that's Australia-wide or held in state-based locations, whatever it is, it just needs to be that it's accessible, because even like as researchers, we had like two of us doing a really hard look for these through the grey literature and also through online peer-reviewed avenues. We found like over 4,000 relevant articles that we then had to screen right down to only about 300 articles. But it's really hard to find this information. In the wake of a bushfire, you don't want to be having to spend 2 weeks trying to trawl the literature to find out what's effective and what's not. You just want to hit the ground running and, you know, have a really good sort of tool checklist in your pocket so that you can go out and roll out the effective actions that, you know, cost effective, but also effective for wildlife management.
Yeah. Yeah, great, thanks. And I might bring Kangaroo Island Landscape Board back in on this question of research. So just in terms of the Dunnart response and the Glossy Blacks response, how important was your existing research knowledge for being able to kind of move quickly on those species? And Paul, in particular, you mentioned that there are open questions about, you know, the species ecology for the Dunnart and other things that you need to know. What kinds of questions do you need to know, and how do you think they will help you? I noticed there's a question in our list, which I might throw to you, on whether we know what kinds of features of refuges were used, other than the fact that they were unburnt areas. You know, what are the particular features of the areas that the Dunnart used as refuges, for example? Do we know that, or do we need to know more? But more generally, yeah, what did you know, and what do you need to know, and what was the value of that research in your response?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I guess initially, I just want to highlight Rosie Honan's pre-fire work focusing on the Kangaroo Island Dunnart in terms of, you know, improving our detectability and then an ability to protect them through controlling those major threats which have been identified as feral cats in the landscape. So, you know, the work that Rosie has done and also the work through KI Land for Wildlife pre-fire really identified those stronghold areas for Dunnarts that were based on historic records over many, many years when they were first discovered in the late 60s, and then really identifying those few areas where they were persisting up until just before the fire. So that research, the development of the species distribution modelling that was done, trying to find out some information around habitats which they prefer, really focused our efforts. And a lot of the mapping that was done post-fire, so identifying where these unburnt patches were within such a vast landscape. You know, you talk about the western end of the island and the protected areas. some of those unburnt patches are tens of kilometres from any road or access points. So just having that information to be able to react quickly and rapidly assess those habitats and identify where populations of dunarts and other threatened species are persisting, and then being able to apply those control techniques around cats in the landscape. We talked previously about how that fire moved through the landscape, but it was also quite patchy as well. So it displaced species. We had dunarts turning up in places, in habitats which they would normally not be found for a very short period of time, and then we wouldn't detect them again. But also it allowed cats to move out of the path of the fire, refuge in these areas, which also became really important critical habitat for threatened species immediately post-fire before they were able to move out into those burnt areas. So our first priority was around assessing these unburnt patches and applying the protection that they needed, and then we were able to look back at those burnt areas where Rosie and I know Land for Wildlife went back into those areas that were severely burnt or partially burnt. And surprisingly, we were able to detect dunarts at those sites not long after the fire. So it raises more questions than answers about this species' resilience to fire. You know, where do they refuge in these severe events? You know, how much does it impact on the population overall? And then what is their response after fire? You know, being able to take advantage of those post-fire resources and then disperse across the landscape. And what we're seeing now potentially is, from what we know from dunart species elsewhere, is a positive post-fire response where we'll see increased numbers for 3 to 5 years and then a decline back to a low baseline level as other factors kick into regulating that population. So I feel like our window of opportunity is now in terms of understanding more about this species, because it's so data deficient. We don't know how they survive fires. We don't know anything about home range. We don't know where they nest during the day. So there's so many questions, and yeah, it's like I said before, it's a real challenge to actually get your hands on sample sizes that will be relevant to apply to those research questions.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that, thank you, that's really helpful. And Carlia, from the perspective of the glossy blacks, did you have anything to add, you know, about the importance of research? I noticed also you might want to speak to some of the questions in the chat about whether the species are using your nest boxes or whether, you know, they're nesting elsewhere, and also some of the best methods for monitoring or measuring the recruitment of alocasuarinas.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess we're in a really lucky position with data as well, because the recovery program's been running since 1995. And so there was population count data, there was nesting success data over a really long period, and nest boxes have been trialled in different areas for a really long time. So we'd also, over the life of the recovery program, mapped all the drooping sheoak woodland on Kangaroo Island. So we know everywhere they could possibly feed. We map as much of our revegetation as we possibly can. Some people do plant sheoaks that we weren't aware of just in shelter belts and things like that, which we've now mapped because birds have turned up there. But we had a really long data set that we could sort of pull out after fire and compare what was happening. And I think as well as, you know, the importance of that long-term recovery program in terms of the activities was so important to making this population more resilient once this wildfire happened. But the data also meant, you know, we've got a lot of comparative data to compare to before the fire with our post-fire data. And I guess in terms of nest boxes, we were, you know, right after the fires, when we realised we'd lost so many nests and so many nest boxes, we were able to pull everything out, do a really quick analysis of, okay, where are our high use nest boxes? Why are they our high use nest boxes? And so we've been able to target our post-fire nest box installation to specific areas where we know the birds are going to use them. And so we've got about 75% of the population now nesting in nest boxes, which is the highest it's ever been. And I think that's because our post-fire installations have been in areas that we've been targeting with this research from, you know, 20 years of nest box data of what gets used and what doesn't. And I mean, it's really tied to basically where the food habitat is and being quite close to food, having a lot of habitat within a 1 kilometre radius, but it's also tied to where their other flock members are. So the birds are really social. They prefer to nest communally. They prefer to have quite a few other pairs within a 1 kilometre radius. So it's really, you want to let the glossy sort of guide you as to where they'd like to nest, because that's not always where the most food is. quite often they're nesting because their relatives and their friends are all nesting in this certain area. And if you put nest boxes a kilometre away from that, they're not going to use them.
Fantastic. That's a great insight into the species and how they, what their needs are, their social needs as well as their sort of really basic needs. Rosie, I might bring you back in here because when we started, or when you started this work, maybe you can let us know a little bit about exactly what we knew about the Dunnart before you began and what was in place. And when you started, did you really have a sense of the work that you might do, where it might go, how useful or important it might end up being, and that we would land here with that work?
That's a good question. So there wasn't a lot, I guess the short answer was there wasn't a lot known about it. There'd been I think there was 5 surveys since the 1990s, and they'd all been pitfall trapped and Elliott surveys. The most successful was by Jody Gates in around the year 2000, and he managed to pick them up at a few sites on Western Kangaroo Island, but they were really poorly understood. I mean, they still are. We know a lot more than we did, but there's still so much that we don't know. I guess the fires really changed the story for this species. It was a really scary time when that came through. We'd got to this point where we knew how to detect them. We knew where they might be on the island. We knew that cats were likely a big issue for them and that they're in high densities around areas where there are Dunnarts. But the fire changed the whole game. Like, it basically looks like a nuclear bomb's gone off. And it was such an uncertain time as to like what it would look like for the future for this species. And there was, I think, like rightly so, a lot of fear. So it's been really amazing, I think, Paul's work, Heidi's work, Pat's work, to watch what has happened. And I think it would be a really different story if the cat control that has happened didn't happen, and if we didn't know how to detect them. And I think that's probably the most useful thing that came out of the research that we did, is now we have good methods, good camera methods that we can detect them with. But yeah, that post-fire work that has gone into that species is what's really changed their trajectory. But I guess it was useful to have that initial research done. Yeah, probably didn't answer your question at all, did I?
No, you did. I think that's great. And I really just wanting to draw out here, the importance of the partnerships for generating what we need to know and what we need to do. So many of our audiences are in research, others are in management. And I think, we all have the experience of the importance of growing those partnerships in practice, so that, when something like this does happen, there's actually a solid knowledge base, but also a solid people base from which to work. So Heidi, I might bring you back in here. You talked about those important management areas and also the connectivity tunnels, the shelters. And so we've had a couple of specific questions about that, first of all, how genetic variability is maintained, or whether it can be maintained between the many different fenced areas on the island, and whether Dunnarts can disperse outside of their own accord, or whether you're going to actually have to really manage for that connectivity and that genetic connectivity. In terms of the safety connectivity tunnels, we had a question of whether you detect predators there. Do they shelter there? Do we know if the native species are targets there or not?
So from our analysis across 2 management zones that both have shelter tunnels, we've seen small juvenile heath goannas use them, but not on a regular basis. So that's a good thing that they're not in there on a regular basis. So I would say that predators aren't targeting those shelter tunnels. So that's a really great thing. The shelter tunnels, and of course the refuge fenced area at Western River, is chicken wire. So it's small holes that your small mammals, your birds and your smaller reptiles can still fit through really easily. So I guess that's a really good thing. And I might even ask Pat to jump in and speak more broadly on the fenced area at Western River Refuge and how we are going to move forward with managing the genetic diversity within the fenced area when it comes to our species like the southern brown bandicoot. If he's there.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, so as Hoddy mentioned, for the Dunnart, genetic diversity isn't such an issue within the fence because the Dunnarts can move and go, can stay in or leave the fence. From the very limited knowledge that we have of KI Dunnart home range is that it does seem fairly small. So our 370 hectare feral cat free exclusion fence, hopefully what we're seeing is a real positive sign that we are getting Dunnarts all throughout this area. So we would hope that we having a reasonably large area where Dunnarts can move and go, we shouldn't see any genetic issues in there. But for other species like the southern brown bandicoot, for example, which we assume have a much larger home range, we are doing some fairly targeted studies of them within there and looking at the genetics and already planning that we will have to in the future potentially move some new genetic stock into the fence. And so yeah, but they're all things that that we're planning for.
So Rosie mentioned really briefly there the absolute, critical nature of the cat control that's happened. One of the questions that's come through is about how much community support there is for cat control, and also whether there's been any shift in cat ownership or in cat containment or other things on the island, both either before or during or after fires. I don't know who on Kangaroo Island wants to take that. Heidi?
Yep, so Kangaroo Island is one of the 5 islands that is charged for feral cat eradication, and there is a feral cat eradication project that is island-wide with all of our partner organisations working together. So the Kangaroo Island Council does have bylaws now that mean your cats need to be registered, they need to be desexed, and if you have a breeding cat, you need to have a permit, and all your pet cats, domestic cats, need to be contained on your property. And the hope is that the next bylaws that will come in, I think still a few years away, there may be a grandfather clause that will mean no more pet cats are allowed to come in. So you keep what cats you have, once they've died off, then there is no more. So that's going to really support the feral cat eradication or control work that we're all working towards across the island.
Great. Thank you. I think I'm going to shift gears a little bit now and go to actually with Natasha needing to leave us soon, I'm going to switch back to the question of the supplementary feeding research. Michael observes that there was a lot of questions raised about the effectiveness, locations and foods used. There was a huge community response, particularly on supplementary feeding post the Black Summer fires, and also just a desire to support a lot of crowdfunding and a lot of volunteer activity. Have you given any thought to how you might go about, or has anyone here given any thought to how we might go about gaining the research knowledge that we need to be able to know what's effective in future to build our knowledge bank on this question in particular?
I guess I can start. I guess my thoughts are that whatever we're doing, whatever action we're doing, we need to monitor it to make sure it is effective and how much effort we're putting into it in terms of resources and costs, etc. Because if it's not being beneficial, and especially if it's being harmful, we need to know about that so we're not just repeating the same mistakes. But if it is beneficial and we learn something about the design, we need to tailor the size of the container to exclude non-target animals, for example. Well, that information needs to be shared. Like same as like nest box design, like as we learn about the types of nest boxes that are suitable, then that information can be shared. And yeah, so I really put a plug out there for whatever knowledge has been gained from these last massive fires. We really need to share the information so that we're better prepared for next time.
Mm. I think I'm going to play devil's advocate there and say it's unlikely that lots and lots of people who are doing volunteer activities to put out food are all going to be in a position to do that monitoring and that research. So is there a way we can target that? Are there places we can do that to gain the knowledge bank that can be used elsewhere? I'll ask you again, Natasha, first, and then perhaps we'll go to someone else on that as well.
Yeah, good point. I mean, individual actions don't have as much, you can't learn as much from them as the big broader scale actions that have, you know, good monitoring design, for example. And so it really should be put towards the larger agencies to be looking into this sort of thing and understanding the impacts of that. And my understanding is that from the recent fires, a lot of monitoring was done, but now's the time to actually make sure that that data is analysed and put out there and made available. I think we have learned a lot, and we're just in this process now of it needing to be put out there and communicated and made accessible. So I really, I guess, urge any people from different agencies that have done this kind of work from the last fires to make sure that you put this work out there and make it available.
That's great. And I think, you know, just back, we also need those systems and platforms for sharing that with each other. So I think we need to be in a phase of building that as well as analysing it. So thank you, Natasha. I know you have to leave us soon, and it was a pleasure to have you. We're continuing on with the Q&A with everyone else. I am going to switch gears now and ask a couple of questions about climate change and about climate impacts on some of these matters. So I'm going to first go to you, Renee, and there were a couple of questions specifically about the ACT context. You mentioned in your talk that climate change is an ongoing threat to some of the species that you're looking at and some of them that you're managing. Can you please tell us a little bit about what exactly the nature of those threats are, what the diverse dynamics are around that? And also specifically with respect to the sphagnum bogs in Namadgi, there was a question from Pandora from the Bureau of Meteorology on the long-term drying and soil moisture impacts. So first of all, did we see recovery after the 2003 fires of those alpine bogs, and did we and was there some kind of combined effect of the drought that we had and the drying impacts prior to the fire in addition to the fire, and also what we can do about that? So perhaps that's embedded within a broader question about climate impacts and risks and the kinds of responses and management actions we might take in that context.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. Thanks for that. The short answer is yes, the bogs did respond to recovery actions post 2003, but I think I need to give you a little bit more context around that. So the 2003 fire, while just as widespread, was different in its severity, and so the bogs were burnt, but burnt more patchily. So I think one important aspect to bog restoration is preserving the patches of sphagnum that survived the fire. And of course, lower intensity fire preserves more sphagnum. So similar actions were undertaken after the 2003 fire and were monitored for 10 years, and the bogs actually came back well. Some bogs were hit in 2003 and weren't hit. So our Janini Ramsar wetlands were not hit in this fire, luckily, because that's where a lot of our threatened species have their core habitat and largest populations. So we were lucky in that way. However, we were unlucky in that a lot of the other bogs were hit with very high severity fire, and not a lot of sphagnum survived. So from monitoring 10 years ago, we understood, we had Trish McDonald come in and lead the recovery works, and we understood what worked and what didn't work, and so those management actions have been implemented, but this time in 9 bog sites with a slightly higher fire severity, some more patchy than others, but we understand that these actions do work. We have set up the 10-year monitoring program, including piezometers to measure soil moisture, so bog moisture content and recovery of water, vegetation recovery in those landscapes, and response to the management actions. So that's a significant collaborative core team between Parks and Conservation Service and Conservation Research undertaking that work and that ongoing annual monitoring at those sites to make sure that these actions still work in a very high severity burn landscape. I did look at Pandora's question, and I do agree that the drying out pre-fire would possibly affect this. There is a lot of research and a number of different institutions working in the bogs to look at climate change effects on the bogs. It is a concern for us. It's one of our most fragile ecosystems, and we are undertaking other fauna projects in response to this. So we're working with Ben Shield and ANU on looking at lower elevation reintroductions of northern corroboree frogs. We're doing hydrological monitoring throughout the park to try and understand the implications of climate change on this resource and in this fragile ecosystem. And so, sorry, could you remind me of the second part of that question, please? To do with climate change.
I think more generally, what are some of the other climate change risks that might be presenting in the park or in the ACT, and what kind of things can be done about that?
Yeah, so there's the other considerations that the other climate change risks, particularly in Namadgi, that we're very aware of, is increased frequency of these large-scale fires. And I did have another question about, do we see a dropout of fauna species in areas that have been affected by large-scale fires twice? And my answer to that was we haven't yet. We're still monitoring that. However, there is some evidence to say that some of the larger gliders might drop out in some of the landscapes that are burnt repeatedly by large-scale fire. However, we're still in early days. We're still collecting 2 years post the second large-scale fire. We do have an experiment set up to see the effects of that, but we are obviously looking at a warmer climate, where more large-scale, high-severity fires, and the FMU is also doing research on whether controlled burning can actually reduce severity of the fires, and they're working with Melbourne Uni, I believe, on this. So the other fauna habitat that does tend to drop out, obviously, is large hollow-bearing trees, particularly in areas where you've got obligate cedars and you need to wait for that regrowth to come through. So as we lose mature trees from the landscape, we do lose the hollows. So that will be part of our hollow availability assessments across the park, looking at what, this is a really important habitat feature for many arboreal mammals and birds. And so what, the availability of that feature across the park, how does that change with higher fire frequency? And yeah, there's also other projects on dieback and other considerations that I won't go into here because they're not within my scope, but they're the primary considerations.
So for our crew on Kangaroo Island, is climate change an issue that you're thinking about, and in what regard? What are the sort of interactions there?
I got a thought. So for some, we ran a bit of a species distribution model for the KI done up, where we looked at what sort of factors predicted the distribution, or at least where we found the species pre-fire, and rainfall was a key predictor of that distribution. Rainfall is predicted to drop pretty significantly on Western Kangaroo Island under pretty much all climate change predictive scenarios. So that is likely, at least for that species, certainly to have big impacts. So K. Dunnock's pretty much only found in that high rainfall zone, which receives over 600, 700 mil per year. Yeah, so that's a big worry. And yeah, where we go with that is hopefully what Scotty will sort out for us. Come on.
Yeah, just to add to what Rose is saying, what we have seen over the last little while is these increased fires. So we know that it's probably not a matter of if, it's a matter of when this happens again. So something that after the fires, we formed the Kangaroo Island recovery team. And so one of the actions that we're currently assessing is potentially an ex situ population of Kangaroo Islands to safeguard something catastrophic happening again with those future modelings that Rosie's talked about. We certainly don't want to see the species being impacted in the future. So yeah, that's something that's currently being looked at, as well as having populations within the Western River Refuge fence that we potentially can translocate into captivity or to other cat-free areas in the future.
Yeah, so just on that question of the risk of repeated fires, Carly, you talked about, the plantings that you're doing now for habitat trees. What is the timeline for that? And do you see this as an important part of resilience for future extreme events that that you might be facing on the island?
Yeah, so I guess in terms of the she oak, I'll try and talk loud because I noticed someone is having trouble hearing me. In terms of the she oak, it might be different to what other species require on the island. So what we're sort of seeing is a lot of the habitat that glossies were feeding in before the fires was more than 60 years since it's been burnt. A lot of it doesn't even have a fire history. She oaks do take a while to get up to good seed production. We think that it's probably 30 to 40 years when they become really good productive trees, where they've got big canopy and they can produce high cone densities, but also good quality seed. So really for this habitat type, we're actually wanting less burning and, putting through cool fires, because drooping she oaks are such a fire sensitive species, won't actually be a good thing. If you put a cool fire through a she oak patch, you will kill pretty much all the adults, and then you'll be starting from seed again and waiting 20 years to get seed again. So they've got a really long time where it's not habitat for the birds, basically. With our plantings, we are looking at those as a bit of an insurance population, absolutely. And we're sort of thinking about spreading. We've been doing it for a few years before the fire, and actually, we do have a couple of patches of revegetation that, because we put a really big buffer between our planting and all the surrounding native vegetation, they actually survived the fires, and they're now patches that birds are using and things like that. So sort of strategically planning our plantings so that they're probably not continuous with other veg, so that they've got breaks around them, and thinking a bit more about where we put our feeding habitat for the birds. And I guess the other thing is, if the she oak, our real concern is we've only got about 2,300 hectares of remnant she oak left. We've got a few hundred hectares of planted she oak from the past 30 years. If we have another fire come through, we will have some of these flocks that they're persisting on less than 10% of the habitat they had. And they do seem to be coping currently, but I guess even if there's not fires, another issue is, like the climate change issue, is we do think that she oak productivity in terms of their seed production and cone production drops in low rainfall years. They produce flowers annually and they produce seed annually. And it's that fresh seed from the previous year that the glossies feed on. They don't feed on the older grayer cones from previous, like further back years. It's always that last year's seed that they're feeding on, the highly nutritious stuff. So if you have a really low year combined with very little habitat, where that year there isn't much flowering and there is low rainfall and there isn't much seed, we could really hit a crunch point with those birds, I think, where they're going to be roaming the landscape looking for more food.
And so just a question just popped in while you've been speaking to, have you thought about the provenancing of the she oak in terms of climate resilience?
Not in terms of climate resilience, but what we have been doing for quite some time is selecting seed off trees that the birds preferentially feed on. So in a remnant drooping she oak patch, the birds will feed on some female trees and not others. Analysis has shown that these trees have a higher cone weight, a higher seed to cone ratio. So there's a lot of seed in their cones, whereas some other trees have smaller seeds. So we're selecting for those trees. I guess the only way we really feel at the moment that we can buffer it is just to have more she oak than the birds actually need. And the more planting we can get out there, although the patches themselves may be lower productivity under sort of reduced rainfall, by having extra area under she oak, that might be a bit of a buffer. But a good question, I think something that we could probably look into more.
Great. I love it when these kind of events sort of provoke questions for further consideration. So we had quite a few questions in earlier on, popped into the Q&A, I should say, about new technologies, and a few of you spoke to the use of monitoring technologies and new. Paul, you talked about the real-time monitoring technologies that are being used. So I wanted to open up to particularly Renee and Paul, but also anyone else, on the importance of new technologies, the role of new technologies in helping us to understand and rapidly come to grips with what's going on. So perhaps for you first, Paul, how important is that real-time monitoring system for determining outcomes, for making decisions?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I guess initially post-fire, it sort of really is a bit of a panic button scenario, and you use the little information that you have to roll out as much effort in the areas that you feel like that they need it. So 20 months on from fire now, we're sort of in a position where we know that we have dunarts persisting in the landscape. We are managing effectively cats in the landscape to a point. It's time to take a bit of a deep breath and look at these technological advances that then we could apply to continue this work into the future. And that's where we've looked at other examples elsewhere and people doing similar work. We actually have the time to invest in getting these sort of technologies working in a landscape like Kangaroo Island. So with our trap alert systems, it means that we can maintain that effort in terms of controlling cats much more efficiently. And we can also focus a lot more on, not that we don't, but just the ethical side. So it's around trap checks. It's about dealing with cats based on an alert and an app system. It's also being able to go to traps that are closed that may potentially have off targets, and then they can be released as early as possible. In terms of controlling cats in the landscape, they're cryptic. Their response after fire is really hard to predict in terms of how they're utilising the landscape, in terms of the distances that they're covering, the areas that they're targeting, how they're responding to the seasonality as well. So a lot of the information that we have on cats is in unburnt habitat, not in fire-affected habitats. So we're looking at applying technology like 4G cameras. So where our camera arrays are currently in the landscape, they require staff to manually download those, sort through the images, identify where cats are frequenting, and trying to predict where we could potentially intercept those cats as they move big distances in that landscape. Often we'll see cats only once or twice and we'll never see them again. Other times we'll see there's a cycle where they're moving 10, 20, 30 kilometres and then cycling back through on a 4 to 6 week sort of cycle where we can potentially target them again. With 4G cameras, we've challenged on the west end of the island with network connectivity as well. So whilst we may have the best technology, applying it into those scenarios can be particularly challenging as well. And I guess it's about getting other user groups involved around, I guess, agencies like the CFS and people that would rely on that connectivity for, preservation of life, property in the advent of a fire, tapping into those networks and jointly putting in this connectivity that we can ultimately use, but then they can use for their purposes as well. So they're the conversations that we're having with other state agencies, emergency response, around how we can all benefit from having better connectivity in terms of our threatened species and pest management response. The 4G cameras just allow us to get those real-time updates of when cats are present in the landscape, and then we can direct those actions in near real time.
Yeah, and I'm really, I'm going to bounce off that to just put a plug in for our next webinar, because I think what you're talking about there about using those systems together and integrating the emergency management and kind of human and social and community level emergency response systems and networks with our response for biodiversity and wildlife is one of the things that we'll be touching on at our webinar on the 9th of November, joining up our systems better. And I hope and gather from what you just said that perhaps because you're an island and a closer community, you perhaps have those stronger networks already, but that's something that is something that we need to look at across many of our jurisdictions and regions. Renee, a couple of questions to you that I noticed that you did actually answer with a typed answer, but I might just sort of put them to you more generally. What has been the use of new technologies, the drones, the eDNA? What kind of things are those new technologies useful for? And are they really changing the game for us, or is there still lots of challenges involved in those in implementing those technologies for the work we need to do?
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. Look, following on from what Paul said, I think it is all about addressing challenges and whether new technologies can help us address some of the challenges, particularly in monitoring and gaining evidence about whether or not our actions are effective. So for us, the choice to use thermal drones was because we really don't have a good understanding about the response of large glider species to planned burning. And so we wanted to make sure we gained the best possible evidence with this opportunity. We're concentrating on a particular block where we have a substantial population of both glider species, particularly greater gliders. And it's a 166 hectare block. And to be able to survey that for gliders, we are at the moment limited by spotlighting along the trails along the perimeter of the block. So we will be undertaking spotlighting surveys at the same time as thermal drone surveys so that we can compare the two methods. But the thermal drone should be able to cover a lot more of that area and give us a much more robust estimate of occupancy in that area. Well, that's what we're hoping. So we're going to be conducting surveys over 4 nights and compare the two methods. And I think for really discrete information needs, like Paul's example or that example, some of these new technologies are great, in particular where your access is limited, so it's quite mountainous country in Namadgi, or where it's just more cost efficient with manpower, would be another example. But I'll let you know how that goes, and I'll definitely write it up as Natasha suggested. The second point was about eDNA. eDNA is not something I've used, and I'm definitely not an expert. There's probably people in the audience that are much more knowledgeable about eDNA than myself. I thought the question was really good that was put up into the Q&A box. I haven't used eDNA mostly because we're working with terrestrial fauna, and eDNA is limited to water, and it's kind of at the moment looking a little bit like a needle in a haystack. I believe you also need a reasonably good genetic library, so you need to have genetic data on the species you're looking for. I think that our aquatic team, which I didn't give an overview of their work today just because we were limited in time, but I believe our aquatic team has been using eDNA, and we have used iDNA for frogs. So iDNA being insect DNA to look for cryptic frog species. But again, it's kind of like looking for a needle in a haystack, and we were actually looking for the Cotter River frog and didn't find it. But we have tried some of these technologies. I think they're very much horses for courses. I think as the technology progresses, then they'll become more useful across broader suites of species, and as DNA, as genetic libraries for areas are built up. And I know that there's some talk of working with ANU for Namadgi species, both flora and fauna, for us to build up a genetic library for species there. I thought possibly the eDNA might be useful for species such as the broadtooth rat that live in close to aquatic environments. So that might be something that I would explore. And I thank the person for their suggestion.
That's great. And I also just want to mention that the Threatened Species Recovery Hub also has had a number of projects on using new technologies for monitoring, on drones, on eDNA, thermal cameras, and on bioacoustic monitoring, including for the glossy black cockatoos that we've been hearing about. So we'll try and pop links in the chat, but also we'll be distributing links to this recording along with other materials, and some of those reports are just coming online in the next couple of weeks. So we'll try and include some of those in what we distribute to all of you. So I'm going to end on, it was a comment in the Q&A, but I think it's a really important question and something I'd like to invite all of you to reflect on. So there was this massive emotional outpouring, a massive personal desire to respond from the wider community to when the Black Summer fires happened. The cumulative capacity of that in terms of citizen science, but also in terms of practical action, is enormous. How do we best harness and guide that enthusiasm and that desire to act that came out of the community? How can we do that in future so that we guide that enthusiasm in the ways that are most effective? And I'm going to ask all of you to respond as a kind of final thought for our webinar today. Who would like to go first? Renee, go.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. Look, just an initial comment. I think the biggest challenge that we faced with this was getting access to the burnt areas. So I think in the many discussions I've had with panels on this subject, you know, the urgency is what grips everybody. They want to respond straight away, and so getting access to the park mainly for animal welfare reasons, to make sure they could do as much as possible. However, straight after a wildfire is an incredibly dangerous period, obviously with falling trees, and it's very high risk for people to access areas. So in terms of that, I think it was at least 2 to 3 weeks before people were able to get into some of those areas, and deemed safe enough even for a vet. We had a small team which had a vet and a couple of select park rangers that went in and did a quick survey of areas that could be accessed for surviving fauna, particularly for gliders, because we knew they'd be very vulnerable, but there was no public access obviously into those areas. So I think that is a very important consideration. I'm sorry, one I don't have an answer to.
Heidi?
I guess from our perspective, we were fortunate in that we could get out to those burn areas immediately after, because they were on private land and we were with the landholders, so we had those permissions. But I guess 20 months later, one thing that really drives the Kangaroo Island Land for Wildlife program is engaging community now in our post-fire recovery activities. So we have just revegetated 10 hectares across 3 properties that neighbours KI done up population areas. We've planted shea oaks and biodiverse plantings. And just the call out that we did for that to engage with our local community and the community on the mainland, we had really positive outcomes with that. We've had groups from Adelaide come over and help us plant trees, and it's just been really positive. And I think that there is definitely space to continue on with that kind of engagement and awareness raising around recovery, and that things are recovering slowly. We also run a education conservation program, and we've seen that grow in and out of the COVID restrictions, but a lot more schools are interested in coming out and seeing what's happening. And that's just such a great way of educating and sharing knowledge into the future.
Great, thanks Heidi. And Pat, I think you wanted to jump in there.
Yeah, I just add a few extra things in there. I think we were fairly lucky to already be on the ground working when the fires happened, and we had we were lucky to already have plans in place, not for a catastrophic fire, but we already had plans to build the Western River Refuge, and had good collaborations with Australian Wildlife Conservancy in particular. So I think while there was having those good plans, good partnerships was also was great. For us, I think the fire was huge news nationally and internationally, and wild species like the koala, for example, and doing rescues of koalas was definitely important, and there was definitely a real animal welfare issue there. We really tried to use the media opportunity to really shine a light on a lot of the threatened species that were endemic to the island and were potentially facing extinction, whether that's the KI Dunart or the species like the green carpenter bee, for example, which had also been really heavily impacted. I think it was really important to shine a light on those threatened species, not necessarily just the the iconic ones like the koala and the kangaroo. So I think that was a really important thing at the time.
Yeah, that's great. Rosie, I think you're ready to jump in.
I guess I've got more of a comment. Working on Kangaroo Island, the community there has a lot of ownership over, I don't know if it's an island thing, but there is a real sense of the island and caring for and loving its wildlife and what makes Kangaroo Island special. And I think, that is really powerful and has been really powerful post-fire. And I guess, in terms of things that can be done now to support, potential recovery from potential fires in the future, I think definitely supporting community groups, wildlife groups, conservation groups that are in your area now, to be able to have that knowledge base, have that those connections, so that if a fire does go through, when you face these sort of situations again, that those people and those organisations are out on the ground and they have the understanding there. And I mean, that's really the KI Landscape Board and KI Land for Wildlife are a testament to that knowledge and that the powerfulness of that passion for conservation. So I think that's the biggest thing that you can do now to support recovery.
Great, thank you. So over to KI Landscape Board, do you have any final thoughts on that?
I guess one thing I wanted to say was, because we've worked with private landholders for a really long time on a lot of our programs, but I guess one thing I was unprepared for after the fire was off-islanders and the sheer amount of people emailing, phoning, trying to send us stuff, and it took up a lot of time. And when you're going through a period where you're on an island that's on fire, and you're worried about your own property, you're worried about the species you're working with, and then there's people just contacting you all the time wanting to throw things your way, it actually became really quite stressful. And we really needed to have a bit of a line beforehand of, look, if you want to help the Glossies, here is our rescue fund that you can donate to. Here are the things you can do specifically. I guess when the fire hit, we were, a few days behind on that, and then the calls started flooding in, and it was quite overwhelming. So I think in terms of managing that sort of wider community, it's really good to have some ideas now, even for species who haven't gone through a fire during these last fires, to think about, just say most of your habitat for the species you're working on is wiped out, and you started getting all these people calling, wanting to help. What is actually useful to you? And I guess having a pre-prepared list of what they can do. For us, it was donating to our rescue fund. And it was sort of donating money into a fund that we've got on the website exactly what we use it for. We use it for specific things like revegetation and nest boxes and things like that. But also, trying to sort of direct that help in a positive way. So that you're not sort of having people sending you things that maybe aren't needed, or showing up on Kangaroo Island, but you don't really have stuff for them to do and things like that.
Yeah, great reflections. And Paul, did you have anything to add?
I think most of the panelists have covered just about everything. So yeah, I guess there was just a huge outpouring of emotion on the island, and the generosity that flooded in, and a lot of local residents were still coming to terms with the impacts of fire on their properties, and a lot of those landholders are still coming to impacts, coming to grips with those impacts and rebuilding their lives. And I guess the Landscape Board and agencies like Land for Wildlife as well have really got to take into those sensitivities around working with landholders that have potentially lost everything. They may not have capacity, even though they care about native wildlife. So offering support to them to be able to focus on what's important in terms of rebuilding a house, infrastructure, maintaining production, while we can assist by taking care of like securing the wildlife, the threatened species, the habitats that they're dependent upon, through grant processes for vegetation, fencing of vegetation, managing water, managing feral species, pests, animals and weeds. So really offering that sort of support while they need to focus on the more important things. And as their capacity grows, they can come on more on board with those programs.
Yeah. Those are great reflections, and really from all of you. I think, a big part of what we need to understand for next time around is how strained our human systems become, how personally affected so many people were in the course of that, and the importance of, agencies that can keep and hold that space, and have that capacity to respond while in the midst of all of the crises that the fires represent, but also in the long run. I think the other comment in the chat that I just want to bring back in is, the role of things like eBird and iNaturalist and other citizen science kind of tools. And really, I think as a way of connecting our communities with our landscapes and keeping that sense of recovery and that sense of contributing and care for our landscapes at the forefront of all of our minds as we go forward, because that as well is part of, I guess, preparedness. So just a reminder to those of you in our audience, our next webinar will actually be talking about some of these human systems and how the human systems can work together for preserving not just biodiversity, but also Indigenous heritage, cultural heritage, and bringing in Indigenous voices into the decision making as well. So thanks everyone for attending. It's been a great discussion. Thank you to all of our panelists and speakers. I've really gained a lot just listening to you and chatting with you now. And thanks to all of our audience for your fantastic interaction and questions in the Q&A. I know it can be a bit difficult when you've only got typing, but it's great to have you participate, and we look forward to seeing you again next time.